Thanks for being our guinea pig today, Zoot. I really appreciate it.
Sure, and I think I know many of you because I have spoken before at ECOC.
Perfect. Well, that's terrific. So, and what is it that you do, Zoot?
So I am a professor of business at Cal State Fullerton and Cal Poly Pomona, and I run a foundation at Fullerton College, getting scholarships. But many of them know me because I used to run the Gene Eschi Center for Nonprofits at Cal State Fullerton.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. And so what's the story you would like to share with us today? Or actually, even better, why don't you just share with us one of your success stories and why you thought it was a success story?
Well, I'll share with you the first time I had to ask someone for money, which is when I was a new director of a center that taught theater in juvenile halls called the Unusual Suspects. And our job is to go into juvenile halls and teach theater to kids. And I was really worried about asking for funding. I was given a lead on a person who is the wife of the president of Universal Pictures, who was very passionate about the subject and had volunteered inside juvenile hall. So I met with her and I told her a story about a kid named Juan that I had worked with when I ran an art program in a shopping mall. And this was a kid that went to juvenile hall and was abandoned at 14. And when he was in juvenile hall, his parents just moved away and didn't tell him where they were going. So when he got out at 15, he had no home to go to, no people. His people literally abandoned him, left him. And he was living in the shopping mall when I found him. And that was when I found out that this was a really important thing to work inside a juvenile hall and connect with these kids before they choose a life where their only family is the gang. So as I was telling her the story, she shared with me a story of a kid she met as a volunteer. And what I learned from that experience is, first of all, my story is only as important as listening to their story, because actively listening to a donor is as important as anything I can tell them. And the second thing I learned is I'm not asking her for money. I'm bridging her desire to give with my mission. And by doing that, I'm really giving her an opportunity to do what she wants, which is to give to a very particular cause that I am in charge of. So by doing that, I feel like I'm giving her a gift rather than asking her for something. And that goes back to your thing of the word selling coming from the word giving.
Okay, well, terrific. Well, thank you for sharing that, Zoot. I'm going to ask you quickly, what was the story that you shared? You said there was you started with the story of the child that was sleeping at a shopping mall who had been, had been left completely by the age of 14, and they would end up going to a gang. But then you transitioned into giving them an opportunity to tell a story. Tell me the story. Continue on with the story that you told this person at Universal Pictures. What was the rest of the story about this child?
The child, when I met them, was 16, and they've been living on the streets for a year and figured out a way to sneak into the mall before they close and actually literally lock themselves in the mall every night. And be off the street that way. But during the day, they were on the street. And, they told me about how they were abandoned. And basically from 14 on, they've been raising themselves. And they were a pretty remarkable person. This person, Juan, he was very artistic, creative, smart. He had spent a little time with a friend kind of couch surfing until that became not viable anymore. And his friend had taught him a musical instrument. And I told him that that's how Prince became Prince. He had spent some time couch surfing in a basement and learned how to play all the instruments that were down there. And that's how he became Prince. So, we bonded over the music and the art. But I was able to kind of refer him to some places where he could get some help. Now, whether he took it or not, I don't know, because eventually he just stopped coming. So I don't know what became of him. And that's often what happens when you're working with kids who are on the streets. But it showed me the importance.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. So we're now going to go through a series of evaluation questions about whether or not this story kind of hit home on all of the elements that you need to share. And so the first one we're going to talk about is, was it a good story? And I think it was. I think it was a great story. There was there was definitely some good elements to that story. Did you tell it concisely? Well, I think the answer, I think most people would agree is yes, you did tell it concisely. Perhaps I'm going to suggest that you told it even, too concisely. But the thing that made it less concise is we didn't actually know what story we were going with. So I think there was some confusion around whether or not we were talking about the story around how we raised some money for this cause because we're talking to a whole bunch of people that are raising money, or where we're just telling a story of this child. I think if we removed the story of the person that worked for Universal Pictures and we were just talking about the child or the other, it would have been a concise story. For today's purposes, I'm going to imagine that we're telling the story of the child because that's the story we can go on to tell more and more and more people over time. Now, did you speak about the customer's emotions? So this is an interesting question. So, Luke, do you feel like you spoke about the customer's emotions at all?
I did in terms of the Universal Pictures wife, but I didn't in terms of the child. And if you're saying that's the story, then no.
Okay, so firstly, and one, I'm just going to ask you to bring forward or swap over the screen so I can see Zoot on the left-hand side. If you can just grab his video and pull it across, that would be terrific. Otherwise, just move the whole screen across so I can see Zoot. That would be terrific. So if we were talking about the child's emotions, absolutely, you're right. We didn't really cover off on them. I mean, we've got a child. I'm sure. I mean, they were probably leaving juvenile hall. They were probably pretty scared about being on the street by themselves. Can you imagine that being pretty daunting?
Yes.
Do you feel like they had no hope for themselves? I mean, you see all these kids going to school and living their lives. They're trying to sneak into a shopping mall. They're worried about getting arrested tomorrow. They're not really thinking about their future, right?
Correct.
What about the name? And I will say that if we were talking about the person at Universal Studios, we did touch on their feelings, but we could have gone much deeper into why they felt it was important for them to raise money, why they felt urged to be part of this, the feelings that they get from making this impact. But again, we're just going to focus just on the child. Now, when you spoke to the child, do you feel like for the first time, perhaps they felt heard, they felt connected?
Yeah, I think with an adult, that's true.
Okay, so now all of a sudden they feel heard, they feel connected. Do you feel like perhaps with the help that you gave them, they may have even felt hopeful?
Yeah.
Maybe less alone, maybe perhaps a little bit less like there's no reason for living. Now, the help that you gave them, what kind of help was that?
Well, I originally, they came to my shop because I had a shop in the mall for an artist in residency. And so they came every day and, would do some work and we would talk. And if there was no one else in the shop, which often was because they were living in the mall, then we would get into more in-depth conversations. So I would give them a lot of maybe emotional support and maybe some good advice that was different than the advice they would get from their peers, because their only friends were other homeless teenagers. And maybe homeless adults. So I was giving them maybe better advice than they get from their peers. And then of course, some resources.
Brilliant. And do you feel like those resources and that support perhaps kept them out of a lot of trouble they would have been in otherwise?
Oh, I'm sure.
And while they perhaps didn't come back, are you pretty hopeful that the fact that they perhaps made some smarter decisions, relocated, maybe made a decision that was in their best interest, perhaps because of your guidance?
Yeah, I would hope so.
Okay. Now, here's one of the things I want to ask you. What was the child's name?
Juan.
Okay. So here's the reason why I'm asking the name. When we talk about an individual, we can't feel the emotions of an individual. I had a client, we had a child. We can't feel the emotions of somebody that's going through pain if it's just a individual client person that we helped. When we start attaching a name to that person, all of a sudden, we can feel all of the pain that that person's going through. I worked with a billion-dollar tech company once, and there was this session that I did where I had to deliver a story from stage like I worked for that organization. And in preparation for that, I interviewed about 6 people that worked for the organization. And I literally interrogated them for like 45 minutes to get the details of the story. And at the end of that, I then summarize the story back in about 45 seconds. And they're like, well, how did you do that? And I'm like, well, through the template that I'm actually going to be sharing with everyone today. I said, but here's what I'm confused about. You said that you've been chasing this CTO for a really long time. Firstly, did the CTO have a name? They went, well, yeah, I mean, the name of the client was David. And I said, okay, so see, here's the difference. If I know the person's David, I can feel that person's pain. I can't feel the pain of the CTO or the client or the child. I said, the second thing I want to understand is what was actually going on with that client. You said you'd been chasing them for years to go into the cloud, and then all of a sudden they just did. Why exactly was that? And they didn't know. They actually had to go away and find out. So one of the things that's important here for everyone as you're creating your stories is, as you're creating your stories, realize there may be things that you do not know, and that is okay. You need to go away and find out that information if it's still possible. Otherwise, perhaps find a story where you can create a much more robust story because you've asked questions. Well, they didn't know. They actually had to go away and find out. And it turns out the organization's server crashed just before Christmas. This was a government organization, employed thousands of staff, and they had this, if it ain't broke, don't fix it mindset. And then all of a sudden it broke. They couldn't run payroll just before Christmas, the biggest spending season of the year. David and his team were the people that ruined Christmas for everyone. How do you think they felt? Now all of a sudden we can really feel the emotions of this individual and what they're going through. All of a sudden it came out, well, how did it feel for David to have to go back to work and his staff to go back to work on Christmas Day? How were the kids and the parent and the spouse about that? I mean, while they had to worry about losing their jobs and get everything fixed before they ran payroll before New Year's Eve. So knowing the person's name also not only allows us to feel the emotions, but also allows us to really think in a three-dimensional way about how the problem was affecting their life, which is really, really important. Now, did we speak to how the customer is now better off after the implementation? Well, you touched on that, but you didn't quite touch on how big a difference it potentially was. And the fact that, you said that he just stopped coming, but we can imagine the fact that it probably, even if it was a bad result, it was a less bad result because of your direct intervention. So which brings me to the last point. What was the moral of the story? So let me ask you, so what do you think the moral of the story for the story you were telling about the child was?
Well, so in the way I used it, the moral was the story within the story. I mean, the moral was about the wife of the executive, but if I was talking about it as just the story of one, then I'd be talking about the moral being how important intervention is with a caring adult in a homeless teen's life.
And your goal was to raise money for doing this more frequently, correct?
Yeah, inside the juvenile halls. Yes, correct.
Inside the juvenile halls. Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you an example of how to tell the story differently, just so you can see a difference. And this is what this is really about is, of course, everyone's going to understand I don't know all the information of the story, and neither does Zoot probably. And also we're doing this on the fly, but it's just to give you an understanding of how quickly you can transform a story when you have an understanding of some of the additional points. Also, I'm going to embellish a little bit because there's some things we don't know, and I want you to get to see what it may look like done differently. So I might be talking to someone about the importance of intervention and sponsoring intervention activities in young teens that have just left juvenile hall. And I'll say, a great example of that was, a child called Juan. I mean, when I first met Juan, I mean, he had a pretty substantial problem. I mean, he'd just been discharged from juvenile hall, and he expected or he hoped that his family would be there for him. But I have to admit, no one, when I first met him, he shared with me, no one was there for him. As a matter of fact, he had nowhere to go. And, for him, homelessness was his entire future. As a matter of fact, he considered himself lucky because he found a secret way to break in to a shopping center so that at least he could have a roof over his head. But as you can imagine, for someone like Juan, life looked pretty bleak. And the only people that he had in his life giving him advice, his interactions, were other homeless people, other people that perhaps weren't the best people to get advice on, and potentially could lead him further and further into harm's way. On top of that, you have to imagine for someone like Juan, it was terrifying for him. Going to sleep every night, not knowing if he would get arrested for being in this shopping center, not knowing if he was going to wake up and find himself in a situation of other people standing over him, getting robbed, getting beaten up. And I mean, kids of that age have so many other things I don't even want to think about what they have to deal with and worry about. Well, anyway, when I met Juan, I started having a dialogue with him, and I must have been the first parent in years that actually listened to him, that gave him an opportunity to talk and share his concerns and share his fears in life. We actually started to transition from life's not worth living to I'm actually hopeful about the future, and there may be some options for me through the resources that I was honored to share. Again, it's not about me. This is an important thing. It's about Juan and Juan's journey. The more we can make it about them, the better. With the resources that I was able to share with him. Now, it was great to see day after day, he would keep walking in to my retail store, and when things weren't, when things were busy, he had even helped out a little, which was great, because he started to take responsibility. He started to see me as a friend. And when things were less busy, I had the opportunity to share more resources with him. We had some deep conversations about things that he needed to talk to that nobody else was likely able to speak to. Now, if I had more time, if I had access to more resources, I would have been there for him more often and made sure that I had a plan to make sure that I never lost contact with him. But Juan, after time, he stopped coming into the store. I'd like to think because we built up his confidence, I gave him access to resources, and he found his way to a better life. But in truth, with your funds, with your ability to support me, which I'd be so honored if you'd consider, I am going to make sure that people like Juan never are left in a situation where they haven't got the resources, they haven't got the support that they need. Because at the end of the day, if we don't support the youth that are getting out of juvenile facilities, we're going to end up dealing with them in later life and stopping them from leading the lives that they truly deserve. Does that make sense?
Very well done.
Okay, so again, remember what I just did was on the fly, but remember it was all about moving towards the moral of the story. It was all about taking them on a journey of Juan and how I just played a part. The person in the story is always the celebrity. I'm just the person telling the story that's honored to be involved, humbled to see the outcome. And when you do that, again, as introverts, as people that raise funds, we don't want to be all I. We don't want to seem self-promotional. So making it about the character allows them to feel that pain, feel that journey, and get to the outcome that we need them to get to, which is I want to support Zoot. I want to help them raise funds because this is an important initiative. So Zoot, thank you so much. Can we all, I know we don't have our audios on, but can we do a virtual clap for Zoot? Thank you so much for sharing that, Zoot. I really do appreciate it, mate. And Juan's going to drop you off now so you can go back to relaxing and not being part of the spotlight. But thank you so much for sharing that.